Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Miriam McHugh, Director for Philanthropy here at the Art Institute of Chicago. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the museum and tonight's conversation, Rembrandt versus Van Gogh, Pushing the Boundaries of Dutch Painting. These two artists, separated by centuries, are among the most celebrated around the world today. Thank you for being here today to explore the influence Rembrandt may have had on Van Gogh and discover their groundbreaking achievements. Additionally, I want to give a warm welcome and thank you to the members of the Buckingham Society joining us this evening. This special group is made up of individuals who have thoughtfully included the museum in their estate plans. We are deeply grateful for their commitment and invite others who share this vision for the museum's future to join this meaningful society. As we begin, a brief reminder to please silence your mobile devices. It is my pleasure to introduce the speakers for this evening's program, Jacquelyn Coutré and Gloria Groom. Jacquelyn Coutré is the Eleanor Wood Prince Curator in Painting and Sculpture of Europe at the Art Institute of Chicago. She specializes in early modern Northern European art with an emphasis on Rembrandt's circle, artistic competition and exchange, and collecting histories. Gloria Groom is Chair and Winton Green Curator of the Painting and Sculpture of Europe Department and Executive Director of Initiatives in France at the Art Institute of Chicago. Dr. Groom has been involved in numerous major monographic exhibitions and their accompanying catalogs, including the upcoming exhibition Gustav Caillebotte, Painting His World, which opens to the public on June 29th. Now, please join me in welcoming Jacquelyn and Gloria to the stage.
Am I okay? Okay. Thank you for being here tonight. It's great. So Jacquelyn came to me about, 7 months ago and said, we should do something with Van Gogh and Rembrandt. And I didn't really know what we were going to be doing, but Jacquelyn is not only an expert on Rembrandt, but as you'll remember, 2 years ago, she did Van Gogh and Avant-Garde, the modern landscape in France, remember? Great exhibition. So she is a lot more knowledgeable at this subject because I can't go backwards, but she went forward. So anyway, we decided this would be fun to do. And of course, with Van Gogh, we have 9 at the Art Institute. So he's an artist that we in Chicago know very well. And with Rembrandt, we have 1. Which you're seeing on the screen right now. And so
let the competition begin, 9 to 1.
Competition. I'm not sure it's a competition tonight. We'll see where we go with this. But anyway, we thought what we'd do is just kind of give some background information of where they do intersect and their commonalities, and I mean besides their Dutchiness. And just to kind of talk about it. Well, of course, with Van Gogh, it's a lot more well-known. We know Kirk, and we know how he played the long-suffering, tormented artist. And of course, there are lots of Van Gogh's paintings, yes, but also pictures and stories to tell. And I just love the Benedict Cumberbatch one where he, that's during COVID, we all watched that. So what I wanted to talk about was with Van Gogh, we know a lot, but not only because of the 106 or whatever movies and programs, but also the correspondence that's been published in the last 10 years, almost 1,000 letters. You can search by word in all of the translations. And so there are 106 references to Rembrandt, either the artist or his paintings, very specific paintings. So we just know how he felt at the moment, where he was, who he was talking to, why he did what he did. And we don't have any of that. Well, we have some of that, but not nearly as much with Rembrandt. So tonight, Van Gogh will lead the way in some ways because it's just we have more about him. But Jacquelyn's going to fill us in on why Rembrandt matters and why he mattered to Van Gogh.
Indeed. So As Gloria mentioned, I dipped my toe into the Van Gogh waters a couple of years ago with Van Gogh and the avant-garde, the modern landscape. And as I began to do a deep dive into the artist, I really began to see a lot of parallels between him and Rembrandt. To a certain degree, they were both enfants terribles, and they were both, of course, very interested in the act of painting itself, according to their own time periods. But if we think about it historically, Rembrandt really kind of came into his own in the mid-19th century. And in fact, the statue of Rembrandt, which adorns the Rembrandtplein in Amsterdam, was erected 1 year before Van Gogh was born. And this came out of a rather impactful political situation. In 1839, with the Treaty of London, Belgium and the Netherlands became independent countries. And wouldn't you know, before their separation, the artist Peter Paul Rubens was the great hero for both regions. But he's from Flanders, roughly speaking, and so Belgium got him in the divorce, and the Netherlands needed a new cultural hero. And so Rembrandt was selected. And there was already a great lore around Rembrandt in the mid-19th century through authors like Charles Blanc, Théophile Thoré, etc. And even just looking at two images of female nudes, we get a sense of how different their approaches are to the depiction of human form and the natural world. And there is a great quote that dates to just after Rembrandt's death that really highlights exactly how Rembrandt looked at, for example, the female nude. Yet when painting a nude woman, as he sometimes did, he did not select a Greek Venus as his model, but rather a washerwoman or a peat-carrying girl from a barn, calling his mistake the imitation of nature and dismissing all else as vain embellishment. Slack breasts, twisted hands, and even the pinched folds of flesh where the body was bound by stays, the garter pressed against the leg, all had to be copied or else nature was not satisfied. And this is a theme, this almost slavish copying of nature continues on into the 19th century re-exploration or resurgence of 17th century Dutch painting. But I'm hoping tonight we can problematize that a bit by looking at Rembrandt and some of his visual interests. But as Gloria said, we don't know that much about Rembrandt. By the end of the night, that will, of course, be different. But let's start with a little biography. Rembrandt was born on July 15th, 1606, in the Dutch city of Leiden. He was the son of a miller and the daughter of a baker. And though we would not expect that a miller would make a decent living, that was considered solidly middle class in the 17th century. And so middle class, in fact, that Rembrandt, as one of the younger sons of the family, was not forced to immediately choose a trade, but was, in fact, allowed to go to the Latin school, and also enrolled not once, but recently we learned twice, in the university. And you see the Academiegebouw of the University of Leiden there, the oldest university in the Netherlands. Art historians like to joke that he probably registered to get a student discount on beer, because there's no evidence that he actually finished his studies, but I share this fact with you to really reinforce that he could read Latin. He, unlike many of his colleagues in the Netherlands, could go back to the original sources and read them, contemplate them, and think about new ways of interpreting them. He was gifted towards painting and drawing, as the early biographers say. And so in 1621, we believe that he started an apprenticeship with Jacob van Svanenburg, who was probably the most famous and well-traveled artist living in the smaller city of Leiden at that time. He had spent 25 years in Italy. And while with him, Rembrandt would have learned how to grind pigment to make paint, how to draw 3 dimensions on 2-dimensional supports, how to mix his colors. That is the foundations of painting. You can well deduce that the fiery hell scenes for which van Swanenburg was known did not really resonate with the young Rembrandt. In order to really refine his content and a sense of composition, Rembrandt went to study with Peter Lassmann in Amsterdam. Lassmann, too, had spent about 3 or 4 years in Italy. He was there and could have overlapped with Caravaggio in Rome. But I share this with you in order to set this stage for this idea that Rembrandt comes from humble beginnings and that he really has a love for the common man. We will see that as a theme, but it's not that cut and dry. Between these 2 artists, they had spent almost 30 years in Italy during a period when that was still not something that every artist did from the north. After his apprenticeship with Lassmann in Amsterdam, Rembrandt returns to his native Leiden and begins to practice his craft. He does so alongside his colleague Jan Lievens, and around 1628 or so, a really powerful artistic vision begins to coalesce. And I show you here what has been called his first masterpiece, the Repentant Judas, returning the 30 pieces of silver. He worked out the composition several times through drawings on this panel, but the composition that is visible today reveals that the key figures of the high priest Caiaphas, here, the poor Judas, who has terrible regret for selling out Jesus for a mere 30 pieces of silver, which he has thrown before him on the floor. All of these figures are illuminated by a powerful light, and the entire action spins out from them. And I invite you to look at the detail of Judas with his torn hair and his tears streaming down his face, the blood dripping down his head, which is celebrated by one of Rembrandt's contemporaries. He claims that one maddened Judas, screaming, begging for forgiveness, but devoid of all hope, all traces of hope erased from his face, his gaze wild, etc., etc. This figure demonstrates Rembrandt's incredible ability to capture emotion during his later years in Leiden. Around 1632, he decides to move to Amsterdam. He perhaps may have been commuting for a few years from the city of Leiden, but the larger, more competitive market is where this ambitious artist wants to be. And so he enters into the studio of Hendrik van Aulenberg, a dealer who also facilitated in the commissioning of portraits. And Rembrandt eventually, in 1634, marries van Aulenberg's cousin. This is Saskia, who is the love of his life. Saskia unfortunately dies in 1642, and one can imagine Rembrandt had an incredible and awful year. The death of his wife, but then the creation of what is arguably his most famous painting and one of his most beloved, the Night Watch. This is a, if you will, annual photo of the soccer team. Perhaps, I don't know if people still do that. When I was younger, we had those. Celebrating the Musket Bearers Guild. And it was hung in their guild hall alongside other large-scale group portraits. We have the 2 main characters of the captain, Frans Bonning-Koch, and his lieutenant, Willem van Rautenberg, and then various members, 16 of them, of the guild in the background. But what Rembrandt learns here, and what he really masters, is the integration of narrative, of storytelling. We know from an old inscription on a copy after this painting that the captain, Frans Bonning-Koch, is telling his group to march out, that is, to go on parade. And that is indicated through the heads of the captain and the lieutenant facing each other, the gesture of oratory, and the background details of the ensign unfurling his flag, the drummer starting to make his booming sounds. But again, this idea of working slavishly after life is not exactly accurate. For the figures bearing the muskets, Rembrandt looked to a 1607 publication that basically outlined musket etiquette. You'll see those figures represented here, here, and here, and the 1607 publication. There is an unusual figure in the background. She is symbolic, dressed in blue and yellow, the colors of the Musket Bearers Guild, and she has hanging from her belt a chicken. This is a visual pun because the Dutch word for klauw, sounds very much like the Dutch word for musket bearer, clovenier. I mentioned that Rembrandt's wife died in 1642. He takes up with another woman named Hendrika Stoffels in the early 1650s. And he really begins to turn to images of interiority and how to most effectively capture that. His Aristotle with a bust of Homer is a great example. It is the philosopher contemplating the poet, perhaps his great oratory, his intellectual life, his humility, his virtue, as was lauded by the biographers, and measuring that against the earthly experience that Aristotle is undergoing, as symbolized by the gold chain that he has been awarded by Alexander the Great, his patron. But in the 1650s, Rembrandt really begins to embrace his rough style, executed with wider brushes, more thickly bristled brushes, and a highly textured paint. So you see the rendering of the chain and the ring with great impasto, and it actually reflects the light to draw your attention to those places. And also the wet bravura brushwork in the sleeve. And the figure of Homer is based on an actual ancient Roman bust. We know from an inventory of Rembrandt's belongings that he had over 80 such busts. And so the fact that he, even in this situation, is imagining this scene purely from his imagination is simply not the case. We know that he had this bust of Homer in his inventory because he drew up an inventory of his collection in 1656 because he went bankrupt. He was forced to sell his grand house on the Prestraat, and he had to move and downsize to a much more modest abode. And this particular story really resonated with Otis Kay, a painter who also lost his savings in the Depression. And when this painting of Aristotle was purchased at auction by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1961 for the astounding amount of $2.3 million, today about $25 million, he decided to make this commentary on the relationship between art and the economy. This is in our collection. It's not up now, but keep an eye out for it. It's always an amusing painting to think about in the context of Rembrandt. And then in the last decade of his life, Rembrandt really focuses on images of connection, of comfort, told through just a handful of figures, sometimes one or two. And he does so in a desire to really focus on the sense of camaraderie amongst all human beings. Really, it's a stage to reflect on humanity when this artist is in his later age. This is a scene typically called Isaac and Rebecca, but we believe that it's actually a portrait of contemporary Amsterdammers dressed in the guise of Isaac and Rebecca. Their faces are quite individualized, and this is a scene in which Isaac tells the people around him in a foreign land that Rebecca is his sister because he fears for her life, knowing, and his own, in fact, knowing that she is highly desirable and he could be in the way of male pursuit of her. And here we see, again, him going and pushing the limits of painting, using a palette knife to apply the paint to the surface of Isaac's sleeve. And everything comes together in this painting. His conveyance of subtle emotion, his ability to tell a story, and in fact, his sense and understanding of interiority. And it is in front of this painting that Van Gogh vows that he would give up 10 years of his life to spend 2 weeks in front of this painting without anything but a dry crust of bread. And it is, in fact, this painting that makes him call Rembrandt a poet.
Vincent was anything but subtle with his writing, but he also loved to deprive himself of food and water, and when he would be in one of his stints when he was feeling like he wasn't doing as well as he should, he would walk without food and water. So it doesn't surprise me that he used crust of bread as a kind of a metaphor for what he would do. But just thinking about what it was like in Rembrandt's time. So Rembrandt also had a studio at one time. He had, as she said, 80 busts in it. Van Gogh was a completely different painter, but one of the things that distinguished him, of course, is that Rembrandt was grinding his own pigments. He had pig bladder to put them in, and you had to use it all up. They were held by string, and once you punched a hole, you had to use it. And so you can't really travel around with pig bladders held by string. I mean, I don't know, but it sounds like really uncomfortable.
I think we need to try it.
Yeah, and you probably don't get as many colors. Whereas Van Gogh grew up, thankfully, after the mid-19th century when tube paint had been, invented and much more mobile, and this is his palette. And the other thing about Van Gogh is that Rembrandt is Leiden, and then he goes to Amsterdam, and he comes back to Leiden. Then he's in Amsterdam, and he lives for, 60-something years. I mean, he lives a long life. Van Gogh dies at 37, and he lives in 27 different places in his 37 years. So there's kind of a big difference right there. This is mapping him. As you'll see, we've marked the yellow house. So everything up until the last 3 residences were rented. So he never had a studio of his own, a room to call his own. And in those rooms, he would put up prints of other artists. He would rip out the, illustrated magazines. He would have photographs. He was involved with the art trade by the age of 16 through his uncle, so he was really part of selling prints of famous Dutch and French artists, including Rembrandt. I'm just showing you here his drawings. He starts out really as a draftsman. That's where he feels most comfortable. And most of his sources are from black and white reproductions and prints. When he goes to The Hague in 1882, he's already tried his hand drawing. He's self-taught. That's another distinguishing factor. And he's tried different careers. He tried to be a preacher, as his father was in the Dutch Reform, kind of a sect of Calvinism. And he takes up with a pregnant seamstress named Sien, or nicknamed Sien, and he gives her a home. She's homeless. He gives her and her 4-year-old daughter a home. And this is when he thinks he has a chance at marriage, at a happy life, at a household. And he brings it up again and again in his letters. But you can see he's kind of snarky about it because he's thinking about literature and he's reading about what a household should be. And he's looking at her and he says, if I didn't believe in reality and literature, she would be stupid. He's living out a literary life. And he's looking at Rembrandt for one of his touchstones, as he would do throughout his career, and especially this one that was known as reading the Holy Family, but he called it reading the Bible. And it was that idea of having hearth and home that comes up again and again in his correspondence. And you can see the cradle with Cien's infant son, Wilhelm, who was born while they were still living together. During the 18 months they lived together. Unfortunately, even though he really thought this was his chance, he didn't really love her, but it worked for both of them. And it's certainly, she was a ready model, and here's his mother on the right-hand side. He thought that he could make it work, but his family completely didn't disown him, but they basically broke with him and said, this is a prostitute, you can't be with this prostitute, we're a upper middle class family. And so he eventually leaves her, and that's it. And that's the last time he has the chance at the hearth and home that he so wanted. But you can see in his drawings, I mean, he's already starting to show that empathy for the lower class, for the peasant class that Rembrandt was always fascinated with, and he was looking to Rembrandt. His time he painted the people at the almshouse. He had favorite models, such as this older man. He's talking about, what a fine model he makes with his bald head and whatever bamboozine suit. I think it means twill, but I mean, whatever.
I think so,
Yeah,
yeah.
whatever. So he would pay a little bit for people. He would keep some old clothes in his studio so he could dress them up too. So there was this whole empathy with the lower class that he felt more comfortable with that comes through during his time in the Netherlands and in Belgium. He was probably the painting at the Louvre because he was in Paris in the 1870s, as you saw. He went back and forth in various rental apartments. And this was one of his touchstones, Rembrandt's Supper at Emmaus, that he was called the Carpenter's Family, or that's what he refers to it as, secularizing what is a holy scene. But that's what he loved about Rembrandt's work, is that he could make the supernatural seem natural. And he saw in this painting of Jesus and disciples, he saw that it looked like his uncles together. And if only his dad, the preacher, would have been there, he could have recreated the Supper at Emmaus. So he's constantly seeing in Rembrandt's work affinities with his own world and trying to make it fit with the world he is creating for himself. The wonderful light you see here, he would do this in a very different way. His response, of course, in the 1880s, when he's still living in Neuenen near his parents, was the potato eaters. Again, the miners, the people who picked the potatoes. He said their skin looked like the brown of the potato peel, and these gnarly people in this very confined, but this kind of wonderful light that he's showing on them. For him, it wasn't really the technical mastery or the convincing likeness. It was the feeling of these people. It was expressing their humanity and their emotions. And he does this in the studies. He wanted to do 50. I think he completed 20 of the people that he was around at that time. And you can see he's really trying to capture their expressions, and he's using these the Potato Eaters is really his first manifesto as a painter. Up to now, he had largely done drawings, and he's really showing that he can do a multi-figural composition, and he does these studies in terms of getting to that final painting, which people didn't like because they didn't look like real people, and it was coarse, and it was not what painting should be, a different approach to painting. But always with Rembrandt as this touchstone. He breaks with his family completely by 1885. This is, again, a manifesto painting. Kind of everything his father hated was the modern French novel, but he's showing it juxtaposed to his preacher's father, Bible. So it's like, Dad. And actually, the extinguished candle refers to his dad, who had died 7 months earlier. So it wasn't really while he was living, he was making this manifesto. But it was showing that you can see he's still using the dark colors of the northern painting. That will change. But he's starting to read novels. He's starting to replace Christianity, which was his father's religion, with a modern religion, with the idea that the artist could be a servant, the artist could have a mission, and the artist could bring consolation and hope to people. He moves to Paris. So that was his last time in the north, and then he moves to Paris, and he will die 5 years later. He moves to Paris in 1886. The first thing he does, he goes to the Louvre, where the self-portrait was. He goes to the Salon Carré. Wasn't that where
Indeed.
Rembrandt? So he's
Yes.
probably looking at Rembrandt's portrait while his brother's like, what? You're here? Because his brother, since 1880, had been supplying him with those tubes of paint that we saw earlier and giving him the monthly allowance he needed. So he lives in Paris for 2 years, and you can see he just absorbs. He's very clever. He can read in English and French and Dutch, of course, and German. I mean, he could read in the original, much like Rembrandt. And so literature becomes a big part of his life. And you can see how he's absorbing the palette of Impressionism and the Post-Impressionists and starting to paint in a very different way than the potato eaters. I love this painting because it just shows how he did everything in the extreme. So he's just like buying every single modern French novel that his dad would have rolled over in his grave, the de Goncourt, the Zola, all the realist novels that he can get his hands on. And now, instead of the peasantry, instead of the rural folk, now he's going to make himself into a Parisian. He's going to read about how they are and what their people are like, and learn to, his humanity is going to switch from one region to another, but it will be still very much there. And it's at this point where he's had no luck with portraiture. He's had to pay people to sit for him. He doesn't have any models in Paris either. He's with some artists, but finding models remains one of his. He wants to be a figure painter, and he can't get models. I mean, he's not easy to be around. So sitting for someone who smells, and he had issues. Yeah. So he begins, for the first time, he begins painting his own likeness. And in 2 years of being in Paris, out of the 37 self-portraits that he does, he paints 25 during those 2 years. And he's using it as a means to an end. Portraiture at this point is a way, you can see these are both on artist boards, so this is kind of like pressed cardboard, paper pressed together, and they're small, like the one in our collection. So he's using them as a means to an end to figure out how to do an impressionist stroke, how to do the divided brushstroke of the neo-impressionists, the divisionists. And so this is where the connection with Rembrandt becomes very strong, because Rembrandt also did like a lot.
Dozens,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
dozens and dozens,
Yeah.
between 60 and 80 self-portraits in print and drawing and paint, and from all periods of his life, starting during his Leiden period in 1629 to the same year as the Jewish Bride, 1665 or so, and even beyond. And he really embraces, Gloria mentioned, clothing as something he kept in his studio. Rembrandt did as well. He was known, according to his biographers, to go to auctions and buy up the bizarre and schilderachtig clothing, in addition to some more luxurious things like the gold chain that we see in the self-portrait on the left. But as with his the rest of his oeuvre, his painting style evolves as well. So we see him on the right in that rough style depicted as the figure of Zeuxis laughing. The ancient story goes that Zeuxis died laughing because he was painting an elderly woman as Venus.
That's so mean.
I know. I was like, the older I get with the bags under my eyes, I
mean,
get
it's
more and more
it's
sensitive.
Mean. It's a mean story.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
It's a great portrait.
It is a great portrait, and I love the way he leans into it with this toothy smile and the furrowed brow. Clearly, he's delighting in depicting himself. And we have, even from his early Leiden period, a series of 4 prints where he is clearly looking into a mirror and analyzing his own facial expression. One of his students writes a treatise in 1678 where he advises artists to sit in front of a mirror and capture their own facial expression so that they can be both spectator and actor, which I think is key. And with that high number of self-portraits in the artists of far superior to any Dutch artist in the 17th century, perhaps even any artist in the 17th century, I would say, Rembrandt had to have been Van Gogh's touchstone. And Gloria mentioned that Van Gogh lived for another 5 or 6 years in Paris. We do see Rembrandt aging across these self-portraits, which unfortunately we never had the opportunity to do with Van Gogh. And you know you've really arrived when there's a New Yorker cartoon about you or something you're doing. In 1987, they published this great cartoon about Rembrandt and his funny hats.
You'll never see Rembrandt, you'll never see Vincent laughing, smiling, nothing. Anyway, this is the portrait that made the myth of Van Gogh, that he is the tortured, that he is the artist who sacrifices himself for his art. This is the story of Lust for Life of Kirk. And, but it's not just the story. I mean, this was a late portrait, and I'll mention this a little bit later. As I said, the early portraits, he's either wearing a suit or he's wearing the smock and the straw hat of the artist. These are the two ways he sees himself, and he's looking at himself again and again. But it's almost like he's looking intently, trying to figure out, not just how to paint himself, but who is he? He does basically, he doesn't dress himself up in costumes like Renoir did with the fancy hats, but he does one portrait dedicated to Gogh in which he sort of describes himself as a Japanese mystic, a simple worshiper of Buddha, which had nothing to do with Buddhism. It had to do with the Japanese way of life, which he really thought was this simple life. And he's showing himself not only in this very amazing background, but he's showing himself as a disciple, because although he was very confident and he felt that he was, going to be the artist of his time, it was Gauguin that brought him to his knees, because he could not. Gauguin was always going to be the genius of art, and he bowed to that. His last portrait he did in Paris before leaving is this very ambitious, because he did, out of the 37 portraits, only 3 show him at the easel. You saw an earlier one. Most of them are rather small scale. Here he is, and he's had enough with Paris. There's too many temptations, but it's a wonderful letter he writes on the eve of leaving, and he says, I went often to the Louvre. I do so love the Dutch artists, especially Rembrandt, who I have studied so thoroughly. And to me, I think that those trips back to the Louvre and to see Rembrandt was a grounding force for him. I can't know that, but the fact that his letters are peppered with back to the Louvre, back to Rembrandt, makes me think that it was what he needed as he absorbed all of the excitement and stimulation and crazy time of the Paris that he found himself thrown into with his art dealer brother.
And he, other than paintings at the Louvre, came to know Rembrandt paintings through reproductions. And we know that he saw this image of Saskia van Uylenburg. It is a study. It's not so much a portrait. It is, we believe, Rembrandt's wife, but she is wearing, again, this plumed hat, rather festive and colorful clothing. And Van Gogh wrote that she is infinitely beautiful with this mysterious smile. But he misinterpreted who it was. He called her a whore, and specifically this image, that of a whore's head, which actually formed a bridge for him, because he was frequenting cafes, enjoying the nightlife in Paris, and he met a woman at a café chantant who drank champagne, and she was hoping that it would make her feel better, but it actually made her feel sad. And so he said that he wanted to depict this very modern subject of a woman caught between desire and sadness. And he was quite pleased with the painting on the right. And it's an interesting connection to these types that both artists were so interested in. Rembrandt made these types, or in the 17th century, we would call them tronies, an old Dutch word for face, as an alternative to portraits. It was a new product for the market, a product innovation, as a famous Dutch, a specialist in Dutch art history from the economics point of view once said. In the 16th century, these types of paintings were used in the studio as props. The master would tell the disciple to go paint an old patriarch into this scene, this biblical scene, or an old woman. But Rembrandt and his colleague Jan Levens said, wait a minute, these could be a cheaper way for us to sell things on the burgeoning open market. And these tronies, or studies, character studies types, often have a recognizable model. And you see the same model over and over again, particularly from the Leiden period. And this figure in particular that you see on the screen was often termed Rembrandt's father. But now we think that might be a 19th century romanticized view of who this person was. Recent research has shown that he might have been a paid model that Rembrandt hired. And in particular, in these tronies, Rembrandt went back to old age, gray hair, paper-thin skin. Again, a very sensitive topic these days for me. But it is something that speaks to Van Gogh's interest in the human experience.
And Van Gogh also, I mean, this is really considered this is really considered his most complex objectified portrait, his bedroom, the first time he has his own bedroom, where he shows the portraits, again, types. So he shows the two people that he was closest to at that time, Eugène Bloch, a painter, and the Lieutenant Millier, but he calls it the poet and the lover. You know, he's seeing them as types, that this is what an artist should be, virility, but also the ability to create. And here they are again. So this is the beginning of him thinking, he's not finding that they're posing for him. This would be kind of the last time he finds models to pose for him, which is why there aren't very many self-portraits done in Arles, where he had the yellow house, because he actually did have a community. And the Roulin family, which is now being celebrated in Boston with all of the portraits of the Roulin family, he did 5 of Madame Roulin, becomes another one of his community, his family. And he sees her as the embodiment of motherhood, rocking the cradle. And just quickly, by this time, he's signing only Vincent. He was kind of distancing himself from the Van Gogh family. Also, he thinks it's too hard to pronounce, and it is. How do you say it?
Van Gogh.
Oh, forget it. Vincent. Anyway, and his friend and frenemy, Gauguin, this is where they really have different ideas about what art should be. Gauguin thinks of himself as the king and as Christ. He's willing to put himself in the Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, going off to make, he's the one who's going to sacrifice himself for the people. Van Gogh did not believe in imagination and memory. He believed in observation. And while his people do not seem exactly convincing likenesses, they were made from sitting in front of them, from looking at himself or looking at them. And so he goes again back to Rembrandt, this holy night, this reading of the Bible, and he reinterprets it, and he talks about it in a letter with a woman reading a novel, but with that same kind of mystical light, but done in the spirit of his time rather than Rembrandt's time, as he would point out. These are the paintings he did after he had the ear incident, and they're made not so experimentally, but really to prove to his brother and others that he was fine, that he had come through it. Also, I don't know, telling his brother, I'm fine, and then sending him one of these portraits. I mean, really? Calculating a little bit, but the one on the right is particularly interesting. He's turned away so that you can't see the bad ear, the severed ear, but he's also used a palette knife, and he develops, as Rembrandt, a very rough style with lots of heavy impasto. When he goes to Saint-Remy, he is confined to a room, and he doesn't feel up to really creating. He has a mental breakdown for a 6-week period, and when he comes back, it is to redo paintings he has done before. So he does a copy of the one that's in the Van Gogh Museum, which is the one now in the Art Institute, no longer with people to have portraits, so he paints himself, and he paints himself into the portrait. And he has this very touching in letter to his brother where he says, the day I got up from the mental crisis, I'm thin, I'm pale, pale as a devil. And then he talks about the dark violet blue, and you can see he's already starting to make these vortexes, these halos that will be in the starry night. And the third bedroom is smaller, and he makes this for his mother and sister. And so he makes a self-portrait, and he cleans himself up so that he doesn't have that straggly look. And he's, again, trying to convince her that I'm fine, I'm back painting. But he's really not fine. He still feels he can't not paint from creating. He needs copying. And his brother, who is so sensitive to him at all times, Theo, his younger brother, sends him print portfolios of Millet, the 19th century realist who he felt, like Rembrandt, was of the people for the people, and he makes copies of the labors of the countryside. We have one of the paintings that he copied. He saw it in print form. I'm just showing you the Pope loves Millet's paintings, so there you go. He was in good company. And one of the last paintings he makes before killing himself was from a Rembrandt print, The Raising of Lazarus, which is a perfect topic for someone who has been in crisis form and is coming back to life, having a rebirth after that. But again, as in the Gauguin, he won't show himself as Christ. He only shows the women in the peripheral people, the people in the holy story, and uses his sister as the face of one of the women in the angel. So he's an artist who, I think the connection with Rembrandt is sometimes not as clear, but I think with his self-portraits, and I think with his ability to make of the ordinary something extraordinary, something remarkable, that is the through line.
Absolutely. And he commented on one of the paintings in the Louvre, Matthew and the Angel, that I started off by claiming the character of the Dutch is that they invent nothing, that they have neither imagination nor fantasy. Am I illogical? No, Rembrandt invented nothing. And that angel and that strange Christ, another painting, it's that he knew them, felt them there. So I would say that one of the things that binds them is, yes, this interest in the natural world, but tempered by a spiritual experience of it, what Van Gogh, I think, called a metaphysical image. And so, thank you.